Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Needs Some Introduction. I'm your host, Victor, and Sona joins me yet again today
Hi.
for a discussion of the Netflix series. Eric, I think this is doing pretty well on Netflix. It's hard to tell. It's just so early. We'll see some numbers when the ratings come out this week. But I think it's number one on Netflix right now. So it's doing pretty well. And this is an interesting show, to say the least. You watched it pretty quickly. It's only 6 episodes long. Well, another nice thing about these things not being too long. I have very, very mixed feelings about this show.
I got
It's,
that sense.
it is doing something unique, which is interesting, I guess, in a way. Maybe a continuation of our conversation of last week of this like peak mid television. Once again, this is something that on paper seems like it should be prestige TV, but it has a lot of the same issues I had with the shows we discussed last week. And just because you're doing something that's a little different, well, in this case, I think it's pretty profoundly different what they're trying to do here. I just am not sure if the show is fully successful at what it's trying to do, but I don't want to put my thumb on the scale too much. You watched it pretty quickly, as did I, but I normally watch these shows, especially these short ones, pretty quickly. You sometimes take a while. So I'm curious. Yeah, go ahead. Tell me what your
Don't
impressions
read
were.
too much into it. It's,
Okay, good.
I had an open window and I knew I had to seize it because, time is just so unpredictable in this stage of life. I had a time I could power through it, so I did.
Okay.
But it wasn't that I just couldn't wait. Although I did enjoy this, honestly.
Okay, good. Glad. I would recommend it also. As I'm watching it, there were things I liked about the show. There were things I did not like about the show. I was curious as they were leading me along. We can get into this. We'll get into spoilers. No spoilers yet, but we can get into spoilers as we go forward. Some of what was pulling me through was I had a feeling that the show was trying to do a certain rug pull that luckily the show didn't become that. And then I think I texted you in the middle of it saying that by episode 3, the show had become what I thought it wanted to be. And I was a little more interested, a little more on board with it. But we got to talk about the finale because, and there will be spoilers of the finale, because where this show lands at the end, it's definitely trying to do something, but is it successful at what it's trying to do? I have a lot of questions. But let's get to just some basic details here. But first of all, I just want to get something out of the way. I think there's just been this thing, probably because of Baby Reindeer on Netflix as well, and just all these other based on a true stories. I had even pitched this to you when I first suggested maybe we watch this about a month ago. That this one was based on a true story too. I like the fact that Netflix backpedaled on all of that because maybe they got their hands slapped a little bit by Baby Reindeer, and the creator of the show said, no. When she did the press for the show being like, this is not based on a true story. She had been like au pair in New York City back in I don't know if it was the 80s or the 90s. And she did au pair for a family that their biography is somewhat similar to what we see here in the film. And then just like living in that environment and with these people in her head, she wrote this story. And that was it's been basically in the back of her mind for decades, apparently at this point. But this is not based on a true story. This is just her inspired by her circumstance at that time, which of course is not based on a true story, by the way. That is basically how all stories are written. So that doesn't count, people. Inspired by my experience riding the subway in the 1980s. So that's not based on a true story. Anyway, just to get that out of the way, if that was part of your approach to this. But yeah, go ahead.
I know you've been talking about Eric for a while and you've been talking about it to me for a while, but I've been disregarding it because I had other things that we were watching together that I wanted to prioritize. So I didn't know much about this going into it, but it certainly brings in this initial sequence of events, Pates, Eton Pates, something like that.
Yes, that definitely resonates. Yeah.
Yeah, which is every parent's worst nightmare, especially when you're raising a kid in the city, of this family that finally decides to let this kid walk to school on his own. And the very first day he's abducted, and that story does not have a happy ending. So it certainly did remind me of that seems to be the only similarity as far as I know.
Yeah, and actually that's an interesting point that you make because early on there's a suspect of the abduction that would correlate to, I think, the actual solution of this case, correct? Which wasn't
I
solved for
think
decades.
so. Yeah, see, decades later. Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about that, but that's true. Yeah.
I'm just pulling this up now.
Yeah, I'm gonna look too. But he went missing in 1979.
79.
So yeah, going to the school bus stop.
So they originally thought it was the handyman. They even arrested the handyman who worked in the building. And then in 2012, there was an 18-year-old who worked at a local convenience store who admitted to strangling him to death. And they didn't even believe his testimony. But then apparently his brother-in-law had some evidence.
Yeah, I think the person who confessed maybe had some mental impairment or developmental delay or something like that, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, schizotypal personality disorder. All right, and he had hallucinations, and wow.
Yeah. Well, I guess there is something similar to the story then.
Maybe.
So that initial event to me was very similar,
Yes.
but yes, as the story developed, it's clear that these are completely different paths.
In the show, let's just lay it out a little bit. So, like you already hinted at, based on this somewhat fictionalized version of this Ethan Pate's story in a relatively similar part of town. Is this you mentioned it's probably the Upper East Side? Is that correct?
I initially thought that this must be the Upper West Side.
Upper West Side, yes.
I'm wondering now, based on, I said that just after the first couple of episodes, I'm bringing it downtown more a little bit in my mind now that maybe it's Hell's Kitchen, maybe it's Chelsea. I'm more in like a Midtown West Side area right now with it. It's unclear. I mean, their apartment is giant. For me, that ruled out the Lower East Side, for example, because it's very hard to find a giant apartment like that there. But he also comes from a very wealthy family. So
yes, a very wealthy. Yeah, I was just going to say spoiler-ish. We'll get into more details of this. Just a mildly maybe spoiler, but there is a sequence at the very, very end of the show where their character has to run from apparently short distance from Central Park to home, right?
Right. I feel very confident about West Side. I'm just not sure where between Chelsea and the Upper West.
Okay. I don't think it's Chelsea if they can run from Central Park, though. That'd be quite a run.
I agree with you, practically speaking, but I've definitely seen in other movies and TV shows, they kind of hand wave the actual distance between 2 points.
But the setup of the show, we have this Benedict Cumberbatch character. At the very beginning, opening scene, I think, of the series, we discover that he is basically in this universe's version of, maybe this is Doctor Strange in another multiverse, by the way, just a Cumberbatch joke there, but because it's not our universe, because he is the lead puppet master on Sesame Street. Right?
Good Day Sunshine.
Good Day Sunshine. Yes, apologies. Their version of Sesame Street.
Yeah.
But and it basically seems to be very much that. It's a relatively new series. For anybody who doesn't know, Sesame Street was, when it came online, you'd never seen a TV show that was geared just for children, that was on during the day. Of course, that is very commonplace now. Not the case back in the day, in the 70s, when they started that. Which, by the way, I assume from watching that this Good Day Sunshine / Sesame Street surrogate was a relatively new thing on TV. So so that's why I started pegging it in probably the mid 70s. I also thought about the garbage strikes back then. I thought about the Ethan Pate's disappearance, of course, which is from 1979 and yet not referenced in the show. So I'm like, is this before the Ethan Pate's disappearance? Also the music, they're playing Vitamin C, which is from 1975. They're playing, at one point, they were playing like Bob Dylan. I think maybe episode 3 or episode 4, they play A Forest by The Cure. So are we pitting this to 80? Because that's the most recent song we've heard is something from 1980. And then, of course, it's almost like we're traveling through time, to be honest with you, because the references from episode to episode seem to move slightly forward. And then I think it's episode 4 where we see an actual tape, CCTV, with the boy walking out of his home. And then we see a timestamp on this particular TV, and it's 1985, which is interesting because at that point, there was no reference in the show at that point for me that we were in 1985. So what did you think about that? Do you think the show is intentionally keeping the time frame phase fuzzy, or Am I overanalyzing this?
I don't think I've given it as much thought as you have. I do think it's weird if this is set in a real life New York City that any parent would let their children out of their sight on the walk to school, given the economic period,
Exactly. Yes.
1979. So realistically, it's strange to me that if that was supposed to, in this universe, world, city, already have happened, this would be exceedingly poor judgment on any parent's part, because I still think about that as someone who didn't even live in the city during that time when my kid gets too far ahead of me when we're walking. So it does have a more 1970s feeling to it for whatever reason. Also, I'm not sure Sesame Street was as cool as it was in the 70s by the mid to late 80s for it to be
Exactly.
like
Yeah,
such a
I
hot
agree.
commodity,
Yeah.
right? So that to me is strange too. That I mean, I think it has a solid fan base, viewership, all of that. I don't think it was in danger of anything happening to it. But the idea of it being such a hot thing that people are so excited to go see in person, and then trying to bridge the gap between the preschoolers and the primary schoolers, all of that seems like something that would happen more in the late 70s, early 80s.
Yeah, exactly. I actually just looked this up for some reason. Once again, I'm pitting everything to my own lifeline. So I was thinking that Sesame Street blew up in the mid 70s, or basically when I was a toddler at the time. And so that's my impression of it. I actually looked it up, and it started back in 1969, believe it or not. So probably by the late 70s, it was already a big thing. And to
Mhm.
and to your point, I think maybe the the shift in the expectations of Sesame Street, the corporatization of what was probably something that no one even thought was going to be successful back in the day. I think that is one of the themes of this show. There's so many. It's my critique here.
So many,
There are
so many,
so many
so many.
issues crammed into. We were talking about how maybe Under the Bridge should have stripped away. Under the Bridge seems elegant in comparison to the amount of stuff they try to cram into this show. This is why I said it was very messy early on. You had seen the first two episodes and you're like, oh, I don't think it's messy. And I was like, okay, well, maybe I'm overreading it, because I think I was only on episode 3 at the time when I told you that. But man, this show gets messier and messier as it goes along. And of their own volition, right? They just keep injecting more and more hot button topics into the storyline. And one of them is this corporatization of something that should be your passion, let's say, for example, right? Which ironically, this is on Netflix, right? So, which is eating up every, the whole other media industry around it. But it's kind of a critique of that, right? Once again, to get into the basic plot of this boy has disappeared. His dad is Benedict Cumberbatch, who also is not only just this guy who is this creator of the Sesame Street like show, but also is the son of this giant, like
Real estate development,
a real
real
estate
estate developer.
developer, tycoon, exactly. And he has bought up a lot of these lower income homes and is also trying to push out the homeless people. There was a big homelessness crisis in New York. It's funny, I hear people complaining all the time about homeless people in New York. In the city now, it was so much worse back in the day. Of course, no one ever puts context to these things. And I do remember when we were probably teenagers, the whole, what was that park where they all lived?
Was it Tompkins Square Park?
Tompkins Square Park. Yes,
Mm,
exactly.
yeah.
So that was something that would be in actual timeline a little bit later than this. But theoretically, this leads to that, right? There's basically they're living underground. Basically start to become visible in the city at this moment. So then maybe this leads to the camps in Tompkins Square Park, and maybe there is some through line with actual history here. But all these things are things that, if you grew up in the New York area, if you were paying attention to the media about that, there are so many of these kind of signifiers for that time. Interestingly, that the writer, creator of the show is actually British. She did live in New York for a period of time, but she obviously probably had some intimacy with the city at this point in time, because there's a lot of things that do echo actual real life things. Obviously, the Aton Pates disappearance, obviously Sesame Street as a cultural force, obviously the post-Reagan New York boom I've just been reading a lot and watching documentaries about New York in the 70s
Mhm.
and how punk rock and hip hop emerged from the 70s because no one wanted to live in New York. So all
Yeah.
these people who were out of college and starting bands, etc. Like now we see these kind of pockets where hip hop takes off, or some of these, maybe not right now, but 20 years ago, Seattle, etc. These places where there were a lot of angry 20 somethings who were creating new musical genres. And it continues with hip hop to this day. Believe it or not, New York, which one of the most expensive real estate centers in the country, was one of those first areas where that happened, because people would move to New York because there were just abandoned buildings everywhere. You could just squat wherever you wanted to. And it's kind of shocking to believe. And of course, the creativity, that cultural populism or popularity, actually brought investment back to New York. And then came the stock market boom of the 80s. And then came all this real estate. And then you see how this underground culture of art and music became the mainstream. And of course, New York boomed, etc. That's the context setting for all of this. And it's not like I'm adding too much context to this. The show is very, very much concerned with that pivot in New York City from the blackouts and the Bronx are burning late 70s to the real estate boom and this kind of depersonalization of big Wall Street money of art in the 1980s. But that's just one of the topics that is being explored here.
Listen, I get what you're saying, but I also like that they acknowledge that all of this stuff was happening at the same time.
Yes.
Whereas with Under the Bridge, since you mentioned it,
Yeah.
it felt like just a one-off line to acknowledge that this could be a thing that is relevant and then
Yes.
never go back to it again.
This is true.
So
Yes.
here, I feel like at least they tried. I mean, arguably, it is too little time to
Yeah.
do justice to those topics, but I did like that they addressed that all of these things were factors in what was going on in this story.
That is a very good point. That unlike Under the Bridge, which just paid lip service to some of these things, absolutely, you're correct. It feels like they were really tacked on. To this show's credit, Eric, there was definitely a desire to explore all of these different stories. My critique of this would be that they are all developed. All these different threads are developed. I feel like Under the Bridge, we have a focused story that has some things tacked onto it. In this case, I completely agree with you about the trying to tackle all these different issues. It's almost like I feel there are 2 or 3 shows in parallel from beginning to end, multiple storylines that don't necessarily coalesce. They're just kind of running in parallel with each other. And I don't want to spoil anything yet, but we got to talk about the ending, because I think that when you get to the ending, that was the intention. And I'm like, I see what you're trying to do. I'm not sure if you should have done it. And it's kind of crazy what it goes for at the end. So before we get into spoilers, I desperately am jumping ahead in the conversation constantly because I really want to talk about the ending, but we will take things back a little bit. We're going to be even more spoilerish now. Where is the line you would say, like, let's say someone's watching this and they hate episode 1. Do you think that they still might be into it? Or if they're still into it after episode 3, do you have that in your head? Like, what's the moment where people should either jump off or stay on this ride if they're interested?
I feel like if you still like it after the first episode, you might as well finish it. It's only 6 episodes. I think after that, the turning point would be in the last episode. And at that point, you've already watched 5.
At that point, it's too late. That's right. You're pot committed. You can't do anything else.
Yeah.
If you've been through 5 episodes, you got to finish the last one.
Yeah, you're in too deep at that point.
When I watched episode 1, I'm like, man, this is very shaggy. And I thought it was going to coalesce at the end. And that would be like maybe my differentiator for, are you on board with this or not? If you're like, these stories really better come together after episode 1, it's not going to happen, right? Like, it's going to get messier and messier and messier. And the themes it's dealing with are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's going to get more diffuse, in my opinion, in how it tries to address all that stuff as it goes forward. So that could be a differentiator for you. If, like Sona said, if you don't mind that shagginess, you enjoy it even, then I think you are on board for the show, and you will appreciate it a lot more than I did. I did
Well,
appreciate a lot of it, by the way. Yeah.
I will say, I think a lot of the acting was really excellent here.
Yes.
And I think that carried this a lot further than it would have gone with
Yes.
lesser
Mhm.
acting. And I say that as someone, I always say this about myself. I can't tell good acting from bad acting unless it's very, very bad or very. Um, but here, I feel like it was interesting to watch these characters the way they were being portrayed. And I think that a lot of the weird stuff about what they've done here was, to me, more usable because I was interested in the characters and seeing what was happening to them.
Benedict Cumberbatch is very good here. I think
Hmm.
I have a problem with him in that he almost always has to do an American accent. And in general, I would prefer that British actors would just speak in their natural accents. That's just my own pet peeve. But and it is a little generic. Like I don't think you've seen, probably haven't seen as much of his work as I have.
I think
And
this is the first thing I've ever seen him in.
really, well, okay, well,
Yeah,
that's
I know
impressive.
who he is, of course, but I don't
Yeah,
think I've ever seen him in anything.
I would say, yeah. If anything, I just a little annoyed with his accent, which is a little generic, with a little bit of New York thrown in there. Regardless, I think in general he gives a good performance here. He has mental problems. I'm not even giving spoilers here. It is pretty clear early on when his son disappears. He already has problems. He has addiction issues. He's a heavy drinker. This is part of his biography. We see it early on. There's a big fight between him and his wife, which is a catalyst potentially for the boy disappearing, their son. The son has his artistic abilities. The character's name is Edgar. The actor's name is Ivan Morris, the young actor who I think does a pretty good job. Kid
Agree?
actors could be very uneven. I think for the most part, he does a good job here. The wife is played by Gabby Hoffman. She can be an acquired taste for me. I think she can sometimes be very hysterical. They let her lean into
Hmm.
that. Once again, I don't blame the actors for this. They're obviously the people who are requesting these type of performances, the directors, producers, etc., are requesting that type of expected performance. I was really impressed with her because she was very naturalistic, which honestly, I've never seen her give a naturalistic performance, I don't think. And I thought she was very, very good here. We have a bunch of alumnus from The Wire shows up here,
Hmm.
as they often do. And HBO shows, it's like they have the entire cast of The Wire to just pluck in and throw into an episode if you want to add a little color here, no pun intended. But maybe my favorite here is David Denman plays this real jerk
Yeah.
from The Office. Is very funny.
What a change from Roy. Yes.
Exactly. Although Roy could be a little bit of a jerk too. So
A little bit, but not all.
you don't know back in the 70s what Roy would have been like. Let me finish that wrap up of the setup. The son disappears, and the dad, he's a puppeteer, obviously, the creator of the Sesame Street like show, but he has psychological issues, also addiction issues, and they are exacerbated by the disappearance of the son and his now complete uncontrolled alcoholism. And he starts to see this creature, Eric, that lives under his son Edgar's bed, supposedly, that he draws all the time. And he's like, if I can make this puppet and put it on the show, this is his fixation. Very interesting. If I can make this puppet and put him on the show, I will somehow save my son. I think that's pretty much where we are at episode 1. Eric appears for the first time. And then we have this journey through New York, which touches on many topics. And one of them is that the police officer who's the primary detective on this, pretty certain. I've never seen this actor in a central role. I think he's pretty good, but speaking, this is where we can start getting into how they're shoehorning things in here. Of course, another big thing that was happening late 70s, early 80s in New York City, especially in 85, when at this point, AIDS was something that people did talk about, but was still relatively contained by the Reagan administration. I think it was pretty late in the Reagan administration where Reagan even said the word AIDS out loud, probably around this time in history. And this character has a lover at home who is older and is dying of AIDS.
Hmm.
And as a matter of fact, there is this whole minor spoilers for this show once again, but is homophobia actually the killer in this whole show? Is it really the culprit here?
Fair. Yeah.
All that is to say that there's only a little bit of that in episode 1. And I remember in those final moments being like, really, do we need to add this to the plot? And boy, not only do they probably need to add that to the plot, it's a huge part of the plot for the remainder of the last 5 episodes. So yeah, that's more or less what you get in episode 1. And now let's talk full spoilers. I'm going to try to walk somewhat through the plot, but I know I'm going to be incapable of not jumping to the end multiple times because I want to get to the end so bad. As the plot unravels, there's a few main plot lines. One, obviously, the continuing search for Edgar and who's disappeared, and early on, we assume is dead. Tell me if your experience was similar to this. As I'm watching this show, what I thought when I was like, I think this is what the show's going to try to do, that they were planting the seeds that the Cumberbatch character was so out of his head or had so many psychological issues and maybe childhood trauma, whatever, that was going to be explored through this imaginary character, that he had actually accidentally, let's say, killed his son. And then that was going to be the reveal. And the show is definitely hinting at that for at least the first 2 episodes, if not more, when they talk about the blood on the boy's shirt, matching his blood type, and the imaginary character being like, oh, they're onto you. And
the cut on his head as well.
Exactly. Yep. Which comes out very early in episode 1. We see the cut on his head. So we right away know that there's something suspicious going on. And I think this is a misstep on the show. There's a lot of things the show does that I wouldn't have done if I was designing this show, but they're intentional. One thing that I think is a little cheap, in my opinion, is having these red herrings and a lot of, like you would in a murder investigation type show, but they're a little cheap. Maybe it's the dad, maybe the handyman who works in their building is a pedophile, right? Maybe they're running a underage sex club out of the local disco, right? They have one suspect almost per episode. Very much feels like a segment within Law and Order, which does the same thing, where there's whoever they suspect in the first 15 minutes is definitely not the person at the end. So it almost has that structure, although stretched out for 6 episodes of TV. What did you think about that structuring of the story?
I didn't mind it because it did seem like a traditional mystery setup. I think this is where the issue of having so many storylines, become a little bit, because you said maybe there's an underage sex club. Well, there was an underage sex club.
That one there's not so much a red herring. Exactly.
In that way, I think it gets a little mucked up because it isn't just entirely red herrings, right?
Yeah, right.
So I think it would have been a little bit cleaner had they been actual red herrings.
Yeah, and this is where the show is muddy, not only in its structure, but I think morally as well. And the show definitely is trying to say something. Sometimes the show seems to be pointing a finger at us as an audience saying, see, you thought it was that person, didn't you? And they're usually someone who is an outsider for some reason. And then yet they'll say, well, in this case, you should pay attention to this clue. But in this case, you're being biased. And I'm like, well, there's not that much difference in the suspect versus incorrect suspect situation. So I am a little confused at exactly what they were trying to pull off there. Although structurally, I do think it keeps you engaged, right? It's kind of a Netflix disease that there's this real need to hook you into the next episode. And it seems that generically with Netflix, there's a prioritization over the let me hook you for the next episode over the is this a satisfying story overall? Yeah. And I think that is really a pet peeve of mine with Netflix. Kind of why I've avoided covering Netflix shows here. That's that they're all binges, which doesn't allow us to go week to week. But I think that is my own bias against Netflix shows. So we have this parallel story, the investigation looking at this boy's disappearance. The father early on is a suspect. Of course, it's in a way I was kind of happy with this in like episode 3. I think late in episode 3, they find a piece of footage that exonerates the father and immediately he's no longer, and it's like that. They don't even make it ambiguous. He's clearly completely off the hook. And now we can focus on something else. And in a way, I like that they cleanly did that, and they do that multiple times over the course of the show. but it did allow the show to start to travel in a lot of different directions. We have not only this main storyline, we have on top of that this gay police officer dealing with that at work. This character is so tied into everything that's happening. Not only is he leading this investigation, he also had another investigation of another boy who disappeared about a year earlier. In that case, a black boy, which of course, another thematic thing here is that white child disappears, headline news. When a black child disappears, status quo. And we've also discussed this as far as all these missing Native American girls over the past decades that have also been neglected. And that's actually been a big theme of multiple shows we've been covering here on the podcast, directly and inadvertently.
Yeah. And I think still true today, though.
True, yes.
Even though they're talking about it in this context, it remains a problem.
Yeah. And I think they definitely want to draw our attention to that as well. But that's not the last connection this character has. He also has an ex-boyfriend who runs this club, who is also a suspect potentially in both of these disappearances, or at least somebody in the club is. Like you mentioned before, there's not only that there might have been some kind of underage sex trafficking in this club, legitimately was occurring. But he's tied into all these different strands, and all of these strands, by the way, they're not just red herrings that disappear. They become the plot of the show. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that links into the whole trash collection situation.
Right. Oh, yes. Yes. The trash strikes of the 80s and 70s is also tied into this whole thing. Yes.
Yeah.
Which I got to tell you that when we were following that person who was one of the trash collectors, who's whatever Slovenian immigrant or whatever his background is.
Yeah.
I early on, I'm like, who's this guy? Like, why is he suddenly? And I was like, okay, well, that was just some minor red herring yet again. But no, that comes back as well. Everything comes back in this show.
Right.
Another moment I want to call out, I was kind of happy in episode 4, I think it was, where we see that the boy was at the bottom of this sewer pipe and that he was rescued at some point. The rope comes down to reclaim him. I think it's at the very end of the episode. And I was glad that they didn't leave us on the hook that this kid is dead, because be in a movie where this imaginary character is a fun co-pilot. And if the kid was dead, I don't know if this tone is going to work.
I understand what you're saying fully about Netflix shows having that hook to keep you watching. I actually didn't, I don't know if they were going for that here, but I didn't find that to be the case here. Like I said, the reason I knocked it out is because I had the available time, but not because I felt like I had to see what happened next. Honestly, I liked a lot of these plot lines because I do think they're very topical to that time. And like we just said, some of them are even topical today. I think what bothered me, and if there's a storyline I could drop, it would be the untreated mental illness with Vincent. Because I don't think people are sufficiently alarmed about this untreated mental illness where he is like fully delusional and he has a history of this. They make that very clear. The scene where he's partying in the club with his kid missing for 48 hours in Gone Girl, Ben Affleck smiled at the wrong time and people were ready to crucify him. This guy is out dancing to Gloria. People are kind of like, kind of weird. Right? Like, if anything was bothering me as I was watching, it's that. And I understand that the way this plot was constructed, it was essential to having this Eric character. But I just wonder if there was a different way to have Eric be some fantastical thing that is in his head for some other reason other than untreated mental illness. I didn't feel it was handled well. If I had to drop a storyline from everything that was happening here, it would be that one.
You crystallized it there for me, and I didn't even think about it till this moment, but you're absolutely correct that the hook of this show is the thing that it needed to remove, which is crazy, but it is tricky. But I think you're right. This is my own curse, but I'm always rewriting, like, how would I fix this thing if I could? And as you're describing all of this, the scenario I think which might have worked is Edgar's afraid of Eric under his bed. And theoretically, he's afraid of his dad, how erratic his dad could be, etc. And then they, once again, full spoiler share, then they reconcile by the end of the show. Maybe what would have worked here, and this is where tone is so important, and I do critique the creators of the show because the director and on TV, more the showrunner than the director, in a movie, more the director. Their main job is to get the tone right, right?
Yeah.
To create a world that you believe in. And that so much of that is tone. I think that the tone of the show, if they wanted to do what they were trying to do here, should have matched what was happening on screen, in the fact that when he starts seeing Eric, he should see bumps in the night, eyes under the bed. Eric is terrifying. And when we think that he might be the killer, this is the thing he's hiding from himself, right? Now, by the end, when he's going on this exploration and Eric is motivating him and he's bundling around next to him, like literally as a fully costumed character, like something out of Monsters Incorporated, and when they're in this ugly underground world, that he still is this light character. So that then when you get to the end and they have the family movie ending where they're jogging, race you back to the house, and they're racing each other, and he's like in full costume racing down the street like something out of Monsters Incorporated, by the way. Literally the tone of the show at that point has fully embraced that kind of family movie theme. Then I think the show
which
could
was
have
such a strange
transitioned.
fit to me. Yeah.
Exactly. The film should have been on that journey where it went from something very, very dark to that. And not only that, but I think then the thing that it tries to nail at the end would be more powerful. The shock of here we are, sun-drenched New York City streets, this father and son hugging each other, and then cut to this Black mother in a junkyard looking for her son's bones, right? That shock of that would have been much more powerful. So I think there was a way they could have made this work. And so much of what doesn't work here for me was this tone just never meshed. In this finale, for example, you literally are moving back and forth from, we're in a Wes Anderson movie, to this politician who had this boy murdered, inadvertently, but, we'll get into the details of that too, which I definitely want to talk about. What is happening? I'm getting whiplash from one scene to the next in this thing.
That tone shift was very jarring to me. I'm happy about ending being the way it was. It's not that I wanted something grim to happen, but it was just like very like zany all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Which the show had not previously been zany. And
I mean, we have a confession of this murder of this boy, this mom dealing with it at this junkyard, intercut with this earlier race you home situation. And then the worst, in my opinion, in a way, is the very, very final last shot, where not only have like the whole family's happy, Gabby Hoffman's with her new lover, her Portuguese lover, that she's, by the way, is a suspect in the show, speaking of where they cut to him and he's like, I hope he's okay. And I'm just like, do we need to throw in suspects here? Everybody's a suspect? What is happening here? We have that reconciliation at the end, but then the throwback of the camera to see Eric like watching them from up above, right? Like the imaginary Eric character up there. And I'm like, we just cut from that mother at the junkyard to this. And we're like, it's all fine now. I'm like, isn't it? It's not fine.
Yeah.
Like anything's fine now.
Not at all fine. Yeah.
To have that dichotomy illustrated, I think is powerful, but to actually end on that fanciful final shot, really, really, really jarring, I have to say.
Yeah.
So here's more that I think is so problematic in this show. It wasn't until they got to the very end and we get the resolution of this story that these police officers beat this kid to death when he was performing a sex act on this guy who turns out, of course, he's not even a random guy. I didn't even suspect the show would go this far. That when the camera pulls back, the CCTV camera, we realize it's actually this politician that's been running for office over the course of the show. I'm like, oh my God, of course. Everything is connected to this case. Oh my God. Okay. Once again, this show's doing way, way, way too much. But even this resolution that this politician went to this club and then not only hooked up, but hooked up with this underage kid, and then this kid, and then covered up his murder. All of this is like really outlandish. And then also that during his confession, we have to have him make some kind of sympathetic pitch that it's like, oh, it's because I've been hiding all my life or whatever. And I'm like, so it turns you into a murderous pet. I'm not sure the psychology there adds up for me.
You're talking about the congressman, right?
Yes,
Or
the
the
congressman. Yes, right.
yeah. What I didn't understand is I was handcuffed. I couldn't see what was happening. Why
Right.
couldn't he just turn his body around? He wasn't
Yeah.
handcuffed to a pole, was
Yeah,
he?
he kept. I like how in the video he keeps kicking the garbage can, like trying to get their attention or to make them stop. And it's just like you said, he wasn't. He just didn't turn around and see what was happening.
Yeah, I know that's not what the focus is supposed to be, but I was very
Right.
distracted by that. There's no reason being handcuffed with your hands behind your back. You can't turn your body around.
Yeah, and then when he's out of his handcuffs, he is literally like pushing around the cops, like, I can't believe, we can't hear the audio, but he's basically yelling at them, like, I can't believe you did this.
Yeah.
It's not
Yeah.
like if he had just turned around and showed his face, he wouldn't have the same amount of power.
Yeah.
That they're like, don't turn around.
Yeah.
And he's just like, okay, I'll just stand here.
Really bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah. The whole resolution there doesn't make any sense to me. And also, by the way, that not for nothing, I think they're trying to draw an empathetic light to all these people who were living this suppressed gay life at this time.
I agree.
But it makes all these characters so villainous that I almost feel like they needed to put in an empathetic romantic relationship with the cop, because if you don't have that character in there, all these people are pedophiles and murderers.
Yeah, which is not. Yeah.
Which I don't think is the intention of what the show's
Yeah.
trying to do. To the point that, and this is a big one for me. It's not even a big plot point, but it really rubbed me the wrong way because it just made me feel how the show was doing. Once again, let's talk about Under the Bridge. The show is doing what supposedly it's criticizing in making the purpose of the show to have Edgar and his dad have an emotional payoff, and everybody else kind of falls by the wayside.
Yeah.
So maybe that's the intention of the show, being like, this is how it always happens, right? Maybe that's what they're trying to say, although I'm not sure that if that's the case, they fully sold it. Because to that point, even his co-creator of the show is apparently a total jerk, because he is focused on making the show successful, where this guy wants to be able to whatever, get drunk and, curse on stage. And he's the hero. And not only does the show vilify his sellout of a friend, this guy is being a pedophile too and kills himself at the end. I'm like, are you kidding me? Trying to make the show successful? What a horrible person he is. I don't understand. The morality of the show at that point is crazy to me. Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in the moment, but there is a big messaging of think of a man you know. He's probably a pedophile, which is not great. So,
yeah, it was pretty shocking. Yeah, and honestly, I think that character's death, it knocks the show down like a whole additional rung to me.
Yeah, I'm not sure we gained anything by him being a pedophile. So that also add that to the list of plots that could have been dropped.
Yeah. When Cumberbatch critiques him and says, well, you have to pay for sex, right? At that moment, I thought that was the extent of what the show is trying to say about that character. He, for whatever reason, doesn't have a successful relationship. Maybe it's because he's closeted. Maybe it's just because he isn't good at meeting people or whatever. So he obviously has some of his own compassion that we could shed on this character. And by the way, he seems to be very supportive to the wife. He seems to be a good guy, basically, right? He's trying to save Cumberbatch's dream project. And honestly, the wife even says this at one point, that like the show would never have succeeded if it was just
Vincent.
Yeah, if it was just Vincent steering the ship, the show would have never become what it was. Which is kind of funny too, by the way, because I think that there is definitely yet another criticism here is the over commercialization of New York, of culture since the 80s, right? Like how even creative things are commodified to the nth degree. And maybe that's why the show is overly critical of this other character, because he's not the vulture capitalist. He simply is rationalizing to himself that he is trying to do the best thing for these people around him. But there's a question mark there. In the end, isn't he like selling out, and he doesn't even know how bad it's going to be for Sesame Street, for example, which was sold to HBO for billions of dollars later on. So there's some element of that, which of course is a huge irony because this show is on Netflix, which is maybe the biggest culprit in that very regard. But if that's the point they're trying to make, to say, and therefore he deserves to die. That's it. I don't think he deserves to die. But anyway, yeah. So that definitely is maybe the relatively minor plot point, but one that definitely rubbed me the most wrong way. But there's other things that are shoehorned in here as well. Some of it is interesting. Some of it really does feel shoehorned in, but the police officer, the main detective's boyfriend, eventually dies. He obviously, because at the time there was no such thing as civil unions or gay marriage, he doesn't have any stake in his lover's life. He can't see them in the hospital. He only gets to see him because he is, basically says, I'm here as a police officer, but,
Yeah.
Obviously has no kind of claim on him. I do find this interesting, by the way. I just had a conversation with my parents, for example. They're afraid of my daughter riding around our block where literally nothing bad has ever happened in the history of the country. But we used to be free-range children riding our bikes anywhere we wanted to in Newark in the 70s. And yet they had no qualms about that. But now it's dangerous. Intentionally or unintentionally, I do like that this show is basically saying, for everybody out there who thinks, oh, it's so terrible now, so terrible now, things were pretty damn terrible 40 years ago, right? When you think about not only for the hidden queer people in New York City, these closeted men, the disappearance of children, like there were child abductions, crime rates were much, much higher back then. So all to say that for everybody who says things have never been worse, and people really do say that in polls, right? And that things have never been worse, never been worse. It's like if you really did take any metric that you want and you compare it to the world 30, 40, 50 years ago, I'm pretty sure your average life is higher quality than it was at that period of time. So at least it's shedding a light on those things. Although I don't know how adept it is at a lot of these different topics. So anything else in the resolution of the story or any other plot points that you wanted to touch on at all?
Interesting choice to make the wife pregnant with her
Yes.
lover.
Did we need that? Yes.
Yeah,
Go ahead. Finish what you're saying, because I
I mean,
forgot that. I do want to talk about that.
Yeah, I don't think we took up so much time with these, so
Yes.
it's
Yes.
not like, things would have been so different had we not included that. So I don't think
Yeah.
it's like, in that way, I don't think it interfered that much with the telling of this story. But yeah, did we? She already was having an affair. Like,
Right.
what further did the pregnancy get us here?
Oh
I
my
don't
God.
really understand.
Just to add to that before you move on to the next point, that is the one moment in the show when I almost stopped watching the show, was when she's fighting with him and she's like, and I'm pregnant. I'm like, and you're pregnant? We need this here. It was she is giving a compassionate performance, but not necessarily written in a very compassionate way. She's in episode
agreed.
1. She's like, look, I'm pregnant and this kid's dead. I'm moving on. Are you sure? I mean, give it a week at least for this lady, please.
So there is that. The person that Edgar was spending time with when he was living underground, the name is escaping me right now. The guy with the hair, right?
Yes.
So distinguishable in the drawings by his hair. I thought that was a really great character. I thought that was a sweet relationship. I liked that. It reminded me, and the drawings and the idea of Edgar following the graffiti. At first, I think it's very much of the time, right? And it reminded me of Basquiat, the way he was doing the little crown.
yes.
I felt like there was a little bit of a call out there that I personally enjoyed. I like that whole thing. I think they did a good job of manufacturing tension with the Rhea character. And is she going to sell him into this pedophile sex ring? All of that. There was tension. I was stressed out about it, right?
Yeah.
I was worried. I wish we had seen a little bit more. Like, it was dramatic to me the way they had the Edgar and Rhea fall off the ladder, and then they insinuated they were both dead, but only one of them was dead. And so that made me think, well, what exactly happened once you fell off this ladder? Maybe Edgar landed on top of Rhea, but he fell first, I think. I don't know. So that, to me, I thought, listen, this kid clearly knows his way around the city. Why not have them go up? He sees that she's not bringing him home. He flips out and he runs home. Like, that just seemed easier than this whole falling off the ladder into the running water. I guess you don't have that stress of wondering if he's alive or not, but it just felt like it was if you were going to include it, I needed more of an explanation of what had happened after they fell off the ladder.
Yeah, and I agree, by the way. I really did like the relationship between the boy and this homeless person. But I did find it, once again, my pet peeve of this show was having to have a new suspect every episode. There are interactions between him and Rhea early on before we know that the boy's even alive, where they're just hinting at him having the boy or the boy's inside of this room, where it very much hints on the fact that he basically has the kid confined and he's telling him to be quiet and not come out, not to protect him, but to, basically hide him away so they can collect some blackmail or something. It's only the following episode where you see them inside the room and how he's like saying, "Why did you follow me down here?" And he really turns out to be this extremely benevolent character, which is, once again, this whiplash in the show where we have to introduce a character and be like, he's definitely the bad guy. And then turn around and be like, actually, no, he's a good guy. And and it's just kind of arbitrary how the show decides that we're going to have this, we're going to introduce you to a character, make you think he's a bad guy, but then show you their humanity and be like really open-hearted to them, and how that happens to some characters and other characters like, no, but this guy is truly a one-dimensional sociopathic monster. I'm like, okay, like either, then once again, this strange duality that the show doesn't quite square for me.
I personally, for whatever reason, I never saw that character as possibly evil, but I could see how one would. I did like the idea of Edgar's drawings creating
Yes.
a map.
Yep. I like that
And the
too.
kid is very talented. Chrysler Building drawing was
Yes.
really great.
Right.
So I like that idea. I liked how Vincent realized that in a way it was a map that he could follow for all the landmarks that this kid sees every day. And, as someone raising a city kid, like I found it very charming in its way that he was tracking those things. I I don't know how to feel about that scene of Vincent underground. Like it just kind of messy. The way that all, first of all,
Oh my God. And that's
coincides with the
like,
homeless
yes.
sweep, and then
Yeah.
he goes underground. He's looking for his kid, but I mean, I know he's
Yes.
in a dark place, but like decides to get high, and then
Yep.
he loses his glasses. But I don't know. His prescription must be very low because he seems to be able to get
Seems
around.
okay. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I don't know. Again, like let's maybe put that on the list of things that we didn't necessarily need.
Oh my God. When he decides to smoke crack at that moment, I was, again, thank God that was so late in the going, because I was like, man, I don't know if I can make it through this thing. Hearing you walk through the plot, I, again, in my head, I'm trying to come up with a more successful version of the story. And that is another thing that I think would be another more successful version of this story. Imagine that the dad is having some kind of psychotic break. The dad looks at that picture, which doesn't become a clue, like a true identified as a map until pretty late in the game, which I do very much like, by the way. And it makes me think about Dungeons and Dragons a lot. I remember at MIT, the whole game Zurk, which came out of MIT at the time, these kind of text-based games were all the corridors and the actual tunnels underground that people used at MIT to get around from building to building, usually in the winter, where they would play Dungeons and Dragons. So it was a kind of an extension of playing Dungeons and Dragons, which of course was very popular at this period of time. Really feels like it could be like another interesting thematically or even historically correlated thing. The kid could even be a Dungeons and Dragon player, for example. All that is to say that I can envision a version of the story where the dad sees this, everybody thinks he's nuts. He's like, I'm on this quest. He's leaving me clues. And he and Eric are on this journey. Meanwhile, he's the prime suspect. The police officer is looking for the dad who has disappeared, which, by the way, you don't even make this up. He has disappeared for like about a week at this point in the show. The police officer is going after him, looking for him as a prime suspect, as he is on the tail of the father, as the father's on the tail of his own son. All these other storylines get tied in, like the investigation continues and other suspects pop up, and then the real mystery resolves itself. I think that would be a more elegant way to incorporate all the things they have here without it feeling as messy. Like you said, I really did like the whole idea that he identifies this as a map, and it comes really late in the show. Easily, they could have used that as a framing device for the entire thing earlier on.
I agree. Yes.
All right. So the show could have been better, but it has some interesting aspects to it. And overall, do you recommend? I think you do recommend this, right, Sona?
I do recommend it. I think it's still an interesting story with some important things to say. And as I said, I think the acting carries it much further than it would go just on the strength of the story alone.
Well, this show made me think about a completely different show that we watched last year that I think, once again, many people did not watch, definitely underappreciated. But it was Steven Soderbergh's series Full Circle, which is also about a missing child
Mhm.
and also is trying to deal with, we're in state New York City and issues there with immigration, for example. And once again, these kind of invisible people who live in these large cities and whole subcultures, and how I thought that very much more, well, I was going to say elegantly, there's some clunky things about that as well. But for
Sure.
me, that is a much more successful way to integrate these different viewpoints and storylines into one central mystery. And I thought that was, and I do want to call that out because I think that's something that no one watched. And if you did like Eric, I would say, hey, check out Full Circle. I think that is an interesting series that hardly anybody watched.
No giant Muppet in that one, though. Just
No,
full
yeah,
disclosure.
unfortunately, if they had a Muppet, then it would really be like for like. But you like Full Circle too, is that correct?
I did enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. Great performances there. A great cast. Really great cast.
Yes.
All right, Sona. And this Friday, I will be putting out an episode where I review Richard Linklater's most recent film on Netflix, once again, called Hitman. A really, really entertaining, dark comedy, romance, another romantic comedy. Glenn Powell, who I think was absolutely awful in that a hugely successful rom-com, Anyone But You, I think it was called, with Sydney Sweeney, which is also available on Netflix, but a terrible movie which made a fortune. And I'm like, what is this Glenn Powell thing about? He is terrible in this movie. Well, check out Hitman, guys. This guy is a star. He is so fun in this movie. And maybe Sona will talk about Richard Linklater's other films, maybe the Before movies, maybe Boyhood, maybe we'll see.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, but do check that out. I think it's a lot of fun. It's just a total blast. Like a movie that unfortunately is not in theaters, but should have been in theaters. So, all right, Sona, thank you. Enjoy your Sunday.
You too. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.